Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Lovely to see you all. You're part of history in the making. This is the very first of our seminars this year, well, ever. So welcome. Congratulations being part of this. We'd like to introduce, I'm going to introduce the panel tonight, but before I get into that, I'd just like to really explain why we're doing this. Why have we decided as a team of science education researchers and teacher educators decided to embark on 5 seminars over the year, and really it's about having a shared conversation. We really want to share some of the things that we've been doing with you, but equally hear back from you and hear what you think about this work and whether it resonates with you and means anything. So hopefully this can be the beginning of that. The panel here are in 2 parts. One part has been funded by the ARC, it's the Australian Research Council, and the other group, they've been embarking on a project that was funded by the OLT, the Office of Learning and Teaching. And both of these organisations are federal, they're federally funded projects. The ARC project, and I'll introduce the people involved with that, is Richard Gunstone, Pam Mulhall, both from Monash, and Dorothy Smith from Trobe. They'll be speaking about their project in a moment. And also the other team, the OLT-funded project, involves Deb Corrigan, Greg Lancaster and Kidman, all 3 of them from Monash Uni. Just a quick overview, the project that Dorothy will talk about on behalf of her team is called Articulate Science, rethinking school education of scientists, and this project's just finished up, so it's going to be excellent to hear some background on how that's gone and what they can share with us. And the other project is a 3-year project. It's now in its final year, I believe, and it's a collaboration between Melbourne, Monash, Deakin and La Trobe, and it's ReMSTEP. It's Reconceptualising Maths and Science Teacher Education Program. You perhaps have heard of it. So the way the panel will work tonight is that each group will have 5 minutes to talk about their project with you, and then we'll hand over to questions. So do start thinking about what you might like to ask, and we'll give you that opportunity very soon. So I'd first like to hand over to Deb to talk about the ReMSTEP project.
Great, thanks Ange. Okay, so as Ange said, I've been working with my colleagues on the ReMSTEP project. Now, it's a really exciting project because it asks us to talk about how can we rethink, how can we reconceptualise science and maths teacher education in particular. For those of you, and I know some of the people in the room, for those of you who know me, I have quite a bit of passion about contemporary science, and I think science and maths and STEM, except I don't like that. I'm going to talk about contemporary science. When I talk about contemporary science, I'm going to talk about engineering, science, maths, technology, because I don't think it's actually helpful to talk about STEM. So there's a political statement from the start. So one of the things that we've been working on is what are the contemporary practices of science and why are they important? So I think that's one of the major drivers of what we've been talking about. So we've been developing a unit of work as part of this project. Now, it's for pre-service and in-service teachers, but its name is actually Engaging with Contemporary Practices of Science. So you'll see that there's an image up on the wall, and what we wanted to do was to actually explore with our students, in this case, what they thought science, maths was actually like. Did they actually have a personal view of the nature of science or the nature of maths? How was it linked with practices of science and maths in real life, in authentic settings? And so, but we wanted them to actually represent that visually. So I had this image up there just to sort of give them a bit of a prompt. Now, we wanted them to do it visually because they all wanted to write about it. So, but we said, no, we're going to actually get you to present this visually because it needs to be accessible. We want to start opening up conversations about how you view science, how you view maths, how you view authentic settings of contemporary practices of science. And we want to have a conversation about it. And it might change as we go along. So it's not about writing about it, because that's actually not all that accessible. Because university people are very keen to write screeds and screeds and screeds of stuff. So it had to be visually appealing. So we used that as this image as a prompt, created quite a lot of conversation, because lots of different people had different meanings about it. So I thought we would give you an example of one student's very short visual presentation.
Science is a human construct. It allows us to investigate the origins of the universe, the formation of our solar system and planet. Science shows us how the natural world works and interacts, the myriad relationships which generate, sustain, and take life. Science is a human endeavour. It is creative, from great discoveries to the day-to-day activities of anonymous individuals and teams. Science is our way of life. Did I say it was a human endeavour? Science is fun. Science allows us to have fun. Science is investigation, analysis. It is everywhere. It is no longer innocent. It is manipulated to meet economic imperatives. It is lied about. Science is destructive. Science is creative, astounding, essential. Humans can save their world with science.
Okay, so just a short snapshot of what one student's view about science in this case was. Now, it was a really interesting thing to do, because through the course of this unit, we've actually got them to keep refining, revisiting what the nature of science or maths or what might be contemporary practices are throughout this course. So this was actually our tracking mechanism. And through the course, what we actually asked them to do was to engage with contemporary practices of science, not as a work experience, but as a communication, as exploring the communication. And we wanted them to do that in 5 ways. So the 5 ways that we wanted them to do it was, and we've called them the 5 levels of science cognitive engagement. So what would the communication look like if you're talking to the public? And so we were actually putting people in authentic science, contemporary science settings across the university in this case. So public science. The second level was if you're actually communicating with people with a science background. The third one was if you're actually using it for the purposes of applying what you actually know. So often the engineers were pretty heavily involved in that. The focused engagement was really as you're talking to peers, so people who are actually in your field. And the other level, the fifth level, was if you're actually talking to people who are recognised as, expert visionaries, the Peter Doherty types, and what is their communication like? So we were actually focusing on the communication, and I suppose if you've been reading the papers lately, this is exactly what Alan Alda is about as well, in terms of what are the communication practices of the practicing science people here. So how do they communicate with all of these different groups is really quite important. And so as they got experience of talking and going through these different levels while they're actually at a site, a contemporary science site, we started to keep revisiting their nature of science to see that it changed. One of the really interesting things we found out, of course, was that lots of people everybody thought the same way. They were very surprised to find out that very rarely did people think exactly the same about science and maths. They were very surprised that they didn't actually have to go looking for the science and maths, that it was actually in the sites that they were experiencing. It was in the communication that they were engaged with these people all the time. So it wasn't a matter of going and looking for the science, it wasn't a matter of going looking for the maths or the engineering or the technology. It was there and it was integrated. And I think that's actually really quite important thing to think of, and why I think contemporary practices and why we've been working with contemporary practices is a far more encompassing way to sort of think, so when was the last time I revisited my view of science? Is it up to date? How do I keep it up to date? Is it the same? Is it different? Even amongst the three of us, we have different views. Creates quite a bit of discussion. And so that's really what we've been doing in terms of our program. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Deb. I'd like to welcome Dorothy to come and speak on behalf of the Articulate Science team.
You're going to have to forgive me, my short-term memory's collapsed. So I'm going to have to use these notes. So I'm Dorothy Smith. I'm the odd one out here because I work at Trobe rather than Monash, and I'm the lead chief investigator on the Articulate Science Discovery Project, which finished last year, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what it meant. So you're getting early results. Well, not really. Okay, science has changed significantly over the last 50 years. And I think there's general agreement about that. But if pushed, most people would describe the changes in terms of science content. You know, knowledge, skills. However, while it's true that science content and capability have increased, the relationships between science and society have altered to a far greater extent. These alterations have significant implications for the ways in which scientists, many research scientists now work, especially the terms on which the value of the knowledge they produce is judged. The project I'm talking about today had its origins in my doctoral thesis, and that thesis had its origins in my experiences as a teacher, a high school teacher of science and physics and some maths, but that was a long time ago. What I came to recognize was that school science, despite the rhetoric of science for all, was being driven by a set of beliefs about what scientists needed for their future careers. And those beliefs hadn't been checked for quite some time. The other driver was that a belief that what future scientists needed was different from what future non-scientists needed, and that implicitly scientists were being given a priority. So my thesis was titled Scientists Are Also Citizens, and this project looks at scientists who are all naturally also citizens and asks if their experience can give us some new options for how science might be approached in schools. We sought the perspective of Australian research scientists on their interactions with various community groups. The scientists we interviewed are typically not consulted about school science, yet their perspective has real value because these are the people who deal with non-scientists in their daily work. They did things like bushfire research, meteorology, forensic science, environmental science. They work with farmers, they work with lawyers, they work with community groups, they work in water, they work with public servants, they work with politicians, they give interviews for the radio, television. These are people you'd recognize if we told you who they were, but they've signed ethics agreements and we won't. This is the Discovery Project. And so our findings are different from the ReMSTEP. The brief of ReMSTEP was work with school, to work with schools and teachers. Our brief is essentially to produce new knowledge. And so our findings are firstly going into the science education research literature. But we do think there are important links to schools. Okay. So we interviewed 36 Australian scientists, 27 were selected because their work brought them into contact with the community. 9 were selected because they taught in first year. They were all research active scientists. 9 were selected because they taught in first year. And we were really interested in what they said about science because most science teachers, as a minimum, I know many have more, but most science teachers as a minimum have first year science. So we were interested in the messages about science that these people gave. So what did they tell us? I have to read this list. Our scientists told us that they believed that scientific knowledge should be shared with non-scientists as well as scientists, because scientists have an obligation to share their knowledge, and sharing knowledge could have benefits for society. They told us that understanding and respecting the other is the basis for a successful interaction. The scientists took responsibility for interactions and tried to engage with others on their terms, that is, the terms of the people they were dealing with. The interaction between scientists and non-scientists is assisted if the scientist has an appreciation of the provisional nature of science, is able to be open-minded, and is able to understand and acknowledge the limitations of science and their own expertise. They also told us that interactions between scientists and non-scientists are more successful if members of the public understand that the process of development of scientific knowledge involves the weighing up of evidence, that scientists typically adopt a tentative and provisional approach, and if the non-scientist is able to be open-minded about science and scientists. These findings at a first pass suggest to us that an understanding of the broader practices and contexts of science, that is, learning about science, should have at least as much priority in the school science curriculum and school science education as learning science content and skills. Thank you.
Thanks to our Team Paddle members for sharing that. Well, I might start with a question. My question was to the ReMSTEP team. I guess we got a good sense of what Monash did as, part of the ReMSTEP project, but maybe you could fill us all in on what the bigger ReMSTEP project looked like, given you were collaborating with 3 other universities. I'm curious. So.
Is that me? That's me. Okay. All right, so the 4 universities got together. We all have done very different things, but the one thing that is overarching what we're doing is that we actually think we have to reconceptualise science and maths teacher education in particular, and education in schools. And the reason for that is the fact that science has changed. Contemporary practices are different. Is that well reflected in the curriculum? Possibly not. I think the fact that there are a generation of STEM centres, for example, is indicating that a need, that we need to think differently. So we took it upon ourselves to really take that seriously, and we've all done different things. So for example, Melbourne University have concentrated far more on developing expertise in primary teacher education, for example, and also working with the GTAC Centre in providing resources that might be more contemporary in nature. Deakin, for example, have been working with their Frontier Materials group and a group down in Geelong in particular about how to engage schools and teachers in contemporary science practices. And Trobe have taken a similar stance to Deakin and have been working with their, I think it's sort of virtual labs, and so making sort of investigations a little bit more accessible to everybody in ways that are a lot more contemporary and a lot more relevant. So I'm a chemistry education person, for example, and I find it depressing that we're still doing the aspirin crack, for example. And so the Trobe group are really working quite strongly around trying to address problems questions that are investigable, and whether you can do that and engage in that no matter where you are. So there's some of the issues that we've been doing, and we've also been working with our science faculty, because the other partner to this unit is a unit for science students in the undergraduate program, and looking at their communication skills for schools and a wider audience.
Thank you. Okay, try again. Yeah, excellent. If you could stand up, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
My name's John Harrison. I'm a science teacher over at Dewback College in Gillian. My question, I guess, is broadly, but I think Jill, you made the comment at the start
Deb?
about...
Deb?
Oh,
Deb.
sorry, Deb, sorry.
That's okay.
About STEM and not liking that term, and I'd be really interested to hear anybody else elaborate on that.
Me or you, Dick?
I'm happy to, but do you want to have
I'll
first
have a go, and then you
I'm
can...
prepared to have a go too.
It's unlike me to be happy to, but yes.
Do you... Okay, so STEM, I find STEM is... I have a view about contemporary practices, as I said. So STEM for me is still, it's so much about science, technology, engineering and mathematics, okay? And whether you include things like agriculture and medicine or health and all of those sorts of things. So it can be the single disciplines, but it gets used in lots of different ways so that it becomes a nonsensical term. Because the other part of it is the fact that it's actually about, you never sort of really find maths on its own. It's always embedded in something. You never find science on its own. It's always embedded in something. So the silos are not useful. So when you're a science teacher then, and you're confronted with educating people for STEM careers in the future, what is it that you're being asked to do, and how do you locate that in the curriculum is incredibly difficult. You know, so you have to think about, I can educate for skills and attitudes and dispositions. I'm not going to be able to educate for jobs because I don't actually know what they're going to be. So I think it's sort of really difficult for teachers in particular to locate that in their everyday practices. So Dick, you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree. And I'll say two other things that I think...
Sorry, I know you don't.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I agree, and I'll say two other things that I think are really quite critical. One is that the silos, phys, chem, biol, these sacred icons, fundamentally in simple terms only exist in years 11 and 12 in high schools these days. They're gone everywhere else. All the action's on the margins, all the action is elsewhere. We perpetuate a whole pile of destructive, non-contemporary things about science by perpetuating the silos. STEM helps do that because it's got its own form of four silos, S, T, E and M. What drives me with a passion about science is that it's a way of knowing that I find fascinating, extraordinary, powerful, aggravating, da-di-da-di-da. But it's a way of knowing which is different from the way of knowing that is mathematics. Science is empirical and non-empirical, objective and creative, all sorts of things. Maths is some of those, but it's not all of them. Maths is other things. Engineering is not science. Engineering is a different way of knowing, not the science way of knowing. Science values generalisations. Engineering values solutions to a particular contextually embedded problem. Let me give you a trivial example. During the late 1980s, as major commercial aeroplane manufacturers developed automatic navigation systems, Boeing, Airbus, McDonnell Douglas all developed different automatic navigation systems. Which one was best? To the engineer, pardon me, bloody stupid question, because each was best for the planes and the manufacturer and the industrial context that one was developed for. And so when we talk about STEM, we're blurring the edges and we're back to the pretense that I was aggravated by when I started teaching in 1962 at Lake Barlake High School. Everybody who was not in science and not in maths said science and maths as if they were the same thing with the same needs. It was nonsense then, and it's even greater nonsense now. And the popularity of STEM as a label just shrinks all these things together and destroys bits of each of them in the process.
Great to see your passion, Dick.
Sorry, I'll get interested in a minute.
Can I use my own mic? Yes. Okay, so, see, we're having this amazing discussion. Should it be STEM or should it be STEAM? You know, because you need to put the arts in there. And
Or is it agriculture?
No, arts. But it could be agriculture. And then, you see, we've got two claims for the E. We have environment and we have engineering. And I was listening to, that's right, it was a talk by a scientist, and the M for her wasn't maths at all. It was, don't remember what, music? Medicine. It was medicine. And I was reminded of what David Layton said about the STS movement. He said, fortunately, it was a bandwagon large enough for all sorts of people to hop on board. You know, broad church, get on board. And then when I look at what happened to STS, I think the bandwagon, you know, subtly different directions when it starts. And then in the 50 years since 1962? Don't count. The bandwagon fragments because everyone's heading off in their own direction. So there's that academic irritation. But the thing that really bothers me about the way STEM's being talked about at the moment is that T. Because at La Trobe, we have some of the last old-fashioned tech ed people. You know, welders and riveters, and we actually have a grad cert of, what is it, Ian, you know? Vet ed or something, yeah. I know what it is, I just don't remember the labels. And yet when you say T, it means digital technologies, and I've got no problem with digital technologies, but there's so much getting lost. So while we argue about the acronym, there's so much getting lost, and I don't understand why we can't talk really simply about giving students a reasonably well-rounded look at how things happen out there. Because then you'd have to put that D in as well. Democracy?
Design.
Yeah. So people are doing STEM. I've heard people talk about we're doing STEM. And I really want to know what they're doing.
They're doing it all right.
So, I mean, that's probably a rant about imprecision. And I understand why, if you're in a school, you have to say you're doing STEM, because no one's going to...
The policy says.
The policy says you've got to do it. But there are all sorts of problems. And that sort of encourages not examining. I think that's what you said.
Probably.
Yeah, but there is a problem, because all of those... And they're not the E in engineering, they're different. Besides, the E might be environment. Who knows?
Well, in some parts of the world it's STEEM, so you've got both E's.
And there's an R. I don't know what the R is. Does anyone know what the R is? We've got a stream somewhere. I've seen literature with an R in it. Yeah. No, it's not. It's something else.
I suppose there are some ways forward.
Writing? Writing.
So I suppose if I was looking for some positives, you know, because it's very easy to look for the negatives. If I was looking for the positives, I must admit I was encouraged in the fact that, for example, you can now do VCE biology and chemistry simultaneously. And still get accredited with it, you know, still get a mark for both of those subjects. Now, I think that's really sort of a start. I think some of the experimental investigations.
That's right.
Greg can talk about that one.
Yeah, the science experimental investigations at VCE, which are now overarching and branch across. So here you've got a case where students don't have to be in one of the silos. You can actually look at that, and there's also, I think, an independent unit where students can just look at investigations, which doesn't even have to be linked towards a science or technology type investigation. They might be investigating music or something else.
The exciting opportunities, I think, are really sort of challenging that F to 10 curriculum and sort of say, you know, can you wring some sense out of it, really? And start looking at it in far more different ways than we've currently been doing.
And I must say, now that I've said what I said about STEM, go ahead and do it. You know?
What about the teachers who are here and who are... Sorry.
Do you want mine?
I'm just curious about
Yeah, the
teachers who are here who are teaching STEM, does it present a problem for them instead of us ranting about what we see are the problems?
As a science teacher in year 7, you teach classification, and we told the students that you classify things to make life easier. So you go and show a single thing. With the STEM, aren't we putting all those things together, and students are more confused about things? That's why we are losing that focus as a student progressing over the years, because with all the technology and things, it's all good, but when they reach to higher level, you see, I don't see a focus there. Like, there's so many things, I have so many options, but they lost their focus. I found that previously students were more focused because it's maths or it's engineering or it's biological sciences. Still, there are some countries where the students go pre-med or pre-engineering in those areas. They're still doing those jobs. They are still finding jobs. Which system are we moving away from that system? Like in comparison, where we produce better students?
When I remember in 1976 when I got to university and I did physics in first year, and the academics were really pleased with me because I understood simple harmonic motion. And many years later, I was on a physics review panel, and those same academics were very cross because they'd looked at the new physics syllabus and they claimed that simple harmonic motion had been taken off the syllabus. Now, the truth is that simple harmonic motion was not in the physics syllabus when I did high school physics, nowhere near it. I learned what I knew about simple harmonic motion in maths. And I studied motion in physics and in maths. I studied the atom in physics and in chemistry. So even then, there were big overlaps. And when I sort of think about your question, I'd say that those sorts of challenges about where knowledge belongs have been going on for as long as we've had school subjects. Some years ago, a school I was in, 1995, a school I was in, embarked on something called the Global Thinking Project. We were very brave. We didn't have any technologies, but we decided that our students were going to communicate with students all over the world about the weather and the climate. And they were going to make meteorological measurements. And the project was taught in English, because they had to learn how to communicate with other people. Science, I have no idea why science was involved, because the people who really knew how to use the instrumentation were the geographers. So I hear what you're saying, but, and I recognize the problem. And I also think that it's inevitable that where knowledge is taught will shift as we go on in schools. But that doesn't mean to diminish how hard it is for schools and for students to tell what belongs where.
Are we people here doing something for science at the primary school level?
The companion unit that we've been working on is actually third year science students electing to go in and work with primary school teachers in their schools. So we had to actually, science had to cap the number of students that went. So we had 60 students go in, and they worked in teams with the primary school teachers in exploring things that the kids were interested in. And so, I mean, it was a fantastic experience for the teachers, for the Monash science students, but also for the kids. And the parents actually even came and started talking about it, didn't they? So, and it was really interesting because they didn't focus so much on STEM. They were just trying to sort of come with authentic experiences and stories that would engage the students. So I'm actually a secondary teacher. If I had my time over again, I'd teach primary. Right? Yeah. And so I think that's really important. I think it's a learning thing, because it's actually not so much about, I've got this passion about it's not so much about what you know, it's what you do with it. So I would think that my expertise in science now is not whether I remember things or not, but it's actually how I help others do things. And that's fundamentally important. And primary school teachers are really good at that, regardless. Yeah. Sorry.
But I think the really important issue to come to grips with primary science is it isn't ever going to be universally present and fabulous. It's just asking too much of people who are expected to teach across the whole spectrum of the curriculum. Personally, I think the central issue in the question you raise has more to do with the ways in which the whole generic group of secondary school teachers adjust or don't adjust their expectations. It's unreasonable to ever expect that every Year 7 student has a thorough grounding in science. It's pragmatically unreasonable because it will never happen.
I really don't see any problem with STEM. I rather favor the way the science is grouping all the physics, chemistry, biology to form the STEM. And if we say teachers, or today we like making acronyms, I envisage that this STEM will even grow bigger. Science coming up with STEM and being realistic in what they are doing. And when you take, by the way, I'm not coming from the science background, I'm humanities, economics, and business. But I'm saying that on the other hand, we have history, geography, commerce, and we combined that in the syllabus. We say humanities, so it could be something similar to this what the science are doing with STEM. And if the world is global, and if in real life we don't see science separately as we walk, we see physics, chemistry, biology combined to make sense out of the world, and now you bring the humanities and language together, then STEM one day will grow bigger to be add STEM, add the acronym of humanities and language to it, and we will form a bigger acronym.
Yeah, look, I'm not confident what your question is, but to identify some of the problems. Coming here tonight, we've got robotics in the other room where there's fantastic little devices that the kids have coded to drive around tracks in there, and if you haven't had a look at it, go and have a look at them, because the students were in there before and it's sensational. But it highlights, I think, for me, one of the problems, the idea of putting subjects into silos. Then take a subject like the robotics. Where is that going to sit? Is it the coding within mathematics? Is it the physics of the sensory devices? Maybe there's some surface chemistry involved in the actual sensors as well. So where do you actually place that in terms of the silos when you come to study those sorts of subjects? And you pick up on what Dick was saying before, that actually all of the really interesting science, the science that's really beginning to push the boundaries, is the science that's occurring in between the actual silos. That's where the interesting stuff is actually happening. And increasingly, I walk around the university and there's huge research teams which are actually now drawing upon the skills from people who were originally in silos but are now amalgamating into project teams, which is a bit like what you've just described. But if we amalgamate it all together, then we end up with an education.
Which is an E.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Oh, that's another E. I can't cope. Esteemed.
G'day, my name's Len Halperin, and despite my age, I'm probably the youngest experiential person in the room because I'm a student teacher and I only started this journey last year, but I've come from 35 years in industry as a scientist. And it seems to me, after what I've heard, oh, by the way, I'm a student of Greg's, so I have to be a bit careful here. But the situation is that... Sorry? Am I passing?
Yeah, carry on.
Oh, that's good. Okay, thank you. From what I've seen in industry and the discussion that I've heard here tonight is that if it's an argument about taxonomy and labels, and if that's what we're discussing here, then I reckon the rest of our house must be in reasonable shape. And even in my limited experience as a student teacher, and I've now had a total of 51 days, I've been in 2 different schools and I've spoken to year 11 and 12 students in maths and physics, and I've said, this comes under the banner of STEM. You're physics students, that's fine, and they seem perfectly okay with that. And when I think of STEM, I think of in the old days when we used to get Neapolitan ice cream, the 3 different flavours. What was the first thing we used to do? I didn't think of silos. I got the spoon and I used to mush them together. So I reckon that's what STEM is. It's a catch-all, and we're doing various things in STEM. And like Dorothy said, and I actually started at university before you did, I can remember Monash before they planted the trees. I reckon that we're in a pretty good place, really, if that's what we're discussing. So go for it, guys. Do STEM.
Greg, do you want to respond?
No, it's all right. It's all right. I'll get to Marky's assignment later.
My name's Mark, and I teach physics. I teach girls, actually, and we do physics in class. For me, it's just, I've come along here tonight just to get some other inspiration as to my challenge. I want to keep the best and brightest girls doing physics in Year 11 and 12 because they're an untapped potential. I've got a daughter and I want her to have those sort of opportunities. So I was keen to hear about what you're doing in terms of engaging contemporary practices of science because my daughter's in the future and what's going to happen there. So I suppose my question is to you, how is this going to help us attract and keep the good kids in science, particularly the girls, because that's the challenge for us at our school is keeping girls in the physical sciences. And more importantly, because I think I've done a bit of reading, I think the research says the girls' schools keep girls in the physical sciences maybe more than the co-ed schools, but then they don't necessarily go into the physical sciences post-high school. So that's the next challenge, I think, for us, but I can't maybe affect that. But girls in STEM, whatever you call it, and I agree with this, I don't care what you call it, let's just do some science together. Girls in STEM, how's this going to impact that? What else can we be doing to keep the girls in science?
Okay. So I suppose that's something that I'm really quite passionate about. And I suppose it was the contemporary practices that I thought that's what I really think is the leverage in our unit. We just did a mapping of all of the sort of research platforms or activities or even the outreach activities within Monash University, okay? And it's astounding what's there. We could never actually tap all of the resource that we've got just sitting within Monash as an institution. So we range from high-level research platforms that's about optical imaging that uses synchrotron, down to things that are, the science faculty, for example, have, all the primary schools come in at a science fair and they work with John Monash Science School with that. So it's a range of things, but the things that even excited our students in our unit was the fact that they actually got to see what it was like. What were the practices actually like? What were people doing with each other? How were they working together? What was the teamwork like? Because for a very brief period of time, I actually wasn't a teacher, I was a hospital scientist, and I gave it up because I didn't ever get to talk to anybody. Okay, and you can see that I actually like talking. So it is actually about engaging with others. I mean, humans are actually social. And so the human endeavour element is fundamentally important. And I was actually quite depressed reading The Australian yesterday, where they were sort of saying, because we do get the best and brightest girls continuing, particularly in the physical sciences. And the latest, the article in The Australian yesterday said, the girls who actually persist in those careers are actually paid 33% less than their male counterparts, and they are given different jobs. So I think, you know, there's some serious things about what's in it for me as a girl that we're not confronting. And our hope here was the fact that we would give them some sort of sense of what was possible for the future, rather than you don't have to stand up and keep doing the same thing.
On the 21st of April, which is a remarkably short time away, I'm going to be talking to a bunch of young women scientists. They're doing PhDs. And they had a revelatory experience because they're at La Trobe and they're treated very well. You know, they were fine, and they went to a conference. And they came back from that conference so incensed at the way they were treated by the other people at the conference that they started to consider that maybe there was an issue with the way female scientists were treated once they got into the workforce. And I'm going to take issue with you here because I don't think it's a STEM thing. I think it's something that is that actually needs to be looked at in its very specifics. I think if you go into some labs, it's fine, and in other labs, it's not. If you look at some engineers, it's great, and other engineers, it's not. If you look at some technology sites, it's fine. Mathematics, women in mathematics, there are a whole set of beliefs about women's brains and mathematics that, in the end, are very detrimental to girls and are, in my view, largely untrue. And I think the research would bear me out. The point is that I think schools do a lot, and I think universities are doing a lot. When I talked to these young women about what was really bothering them, like what did they want me to say, they said they wanted me to address the fact that their parents and their extended family were paying out on them because they weren't home cooking dinner. That, yes, I know, and it's the 21st century. So I think...
I get so passionate when people talk.
And they're going to be lucky because you're not going to pay out on them, you know. And, you know, she said, it's not my partner. He's fantastic. But what do I do about his aunt? And the only advice I could give was grow a thicker skin. So I hear what you're saying, and I think everything you're doing is absolutely fantastic, but we need to see this in its broader context of the dominant discourse in society and how many more decades it's going to take. And having said that, every single person who doesn't pay out on her for not cooking dinner, hey, it's a win, isn't it? Yeah, so it's, yeah.
I'll just add, I teach a physics method at Monash, and that class is usually about 50% split in gender. So it's 50% males, 50% females. And of the 50% of females who are in that class, I won't say all of them, but certainly a large number of them are there because they cannot find jobs as research scientists or in the area of science. And I think this is underpinning a really interesting problem because we've got the innovative nation. We're pushing towards the idea that STEM is going to be the miraculous saver of our economy. We're going to open up a whole wealth of jobs for people. And I see the other end of it. We're actually, even now, when we're supposedly having some sort of a crisis, I've got students in front of me who cannot get jobs in the area. So that's a bit of a downer on the whole thing, really, but nevertheless, it's a reality. Yeah.
Well, actually, my comment is not. The comment I was going to make is not really about gender, and I will just offer the comment that there are an awful lot of students who have PhDs in science who can't get jobs, and it's not related necessarily to gender. And I say that as somebody whose daughter is talking about doing a PhD in ecology at the moment. Anyway, a bit concerned about whether that's a wise undertaking for those reasons. But what I was going to say, though, just in terms of encouraging more students to do science, one of the things that I think has come out of our project has been that, or one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is that the stories we tell in science, in school science, and I think university science, tend to very much focus on science as discovery. You know, scientists are discovering stuff all the time, saving the world and so forth, or science being applied. And one of the things that's come out through this project is just the importance of scientists interacting with non-scientists, talking to non-scientists about science, whether it's to farmers or to angry citizens who are worried about, you know, trucks roaring up and down the street that are producing lots and lots of pollution that's, you know, potentially hazardous to their children and so forth. Whether or not it's people who are concerned about climate change or whatever. There are lots of scientists today who are talking to a large range of non-scientists about science. So there's that sort of human interaction that kind of Deb was alluding to that is part of the everyday work of scientists. And we don't talk about that as science teachers. Or at least I didn't as a science teacher, and I would hazard a guess that many of you don't either. We tend to focus on the science that's being discovered and how you explain that. And one of the things that we were curious to know when we were talking to these scientists was, well, how do you talk to people who haven't got a scientific background? And that was a tricky thing because, you know, there was one person we talked to who said, well, in a given week I might talk to the Prime Minister and I also might talk to a group of kindergarten children. And I have to be able to talk in different ways to those, you know, according to the group that or the single person in this particular instance. Sorry? Oh, exactly. So
okay with kindergarten.
So there was inappropriate laughter in the group over there.
So I won't tell you who was the Prime Minister at that point. But so the point is though that the scientist has to be able to talk about science in different ways, and I don't think that is something that we don't foster in our future scientists to be able to do that. We tend to focus on the science way of explaining things. Scientists talk about having to learn how to do that. And maybe that's something that, you know, we could be thinking about more. And I think that if we focused on that people bit, you know, that interaction, that is part of the work of many scientists, I think that might be more attractive to a lot of students. So I think that is something that has come out of our project that you might be interested in thinking about and taking on board in your own teaching.
Yeah, great. This will be our very last question because we're getting right to the last moment. So thank you.
So it's really a question to everyone in this room. Do you think being a good scientific education practitioner an important role? I think that's obvious. It is, yes. You apply scientific practice. Scientific practice is you go out and you get evidence from a hypothesis and then you employ best practice. So my question really to everyone in this room, what are you going to do from tonight using the knowledge which has come from these experts? Because if you don't go out and make a difference, I think you've all wasted the time.
Thanks for your good question. I may actually, it's a great segue. Actually, I'm going to come back if there's a comment. We're actually being a little bit sneaky, and we're also launching a book this evening, which actually one I prepared earlier. Actually, this tells the stories of science pre-service teachers, and them reflecting on what they've learned from some of these people and how they've taken that. And I'm going to let Lucy explain much better what this book actually captures.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ange. And thank you also to everyone for presenting. I think it's really important to make those links and bridges between university and academia and science teachers who are in industry. So what we put together is a collection or an anthology, if you will, of our stories as pre-service teachers of what we found when we went out into schools. And especially with, I think, the master's program, everyone comes from completely different backgrounds. So it was quite interesting when you get into a teaching course after doing a science degree and you're familiar with case-based styles of learning where you get given a story to read about an experience and then you dissect it and try to learn from that. But what we found was that a lot of those stories were written by expert teachers, and when you're in your first week of trying to conceptualise that jump from being a student to being a teacher, that's really hard to relate to. So we wanted to create a formal way that we could share our stories with each other and with other pre-service teachers and academics and teachers in schools, because I'm sure, especially those of you who've spoken tonight are all experienced teachers. So I'm sure you've been mentor teachers to pre-service teachers. And I think that link is really important because that's where we get the realities of the classroom, if you will. So it's quite interesting, our publication, I think, for mentors to read, because it shows you what issues are important to pre-service teachers. Because while it might be easy for you to cast your mind back those 15, 20 years to when you were standing there and you forget a student's name and then everyone laughs at you and you want to just run out of the room, it is hard to remember. And I think today is a very different climate in the classroom. So we put together this book, and so I thought it would be nice. The second edition is just being printed now, so we should get copies next week. So it was a nice opportunity to stand here and say, this is another part of what we're doing in the education faculty at Monash that's driven by the students. So I wanted to share it with you all. So if you have any questions, let me know.
Yeah, so just final comments.
Thanks for your Thanks for your question. For me, where am I going from here? I'm going back to the curriculum documents. I'm going to look at the communication component of the science inquiry skills, and I'm also going to look at the human endeavour, because I think they're the two parts that are critical that we seem to be missing. I know I was definitely missing them when I was teaching, and I probably shouldn't say this with Deb around. I still tend to skip them a bit in my teaching with the pre-service teachers. I think that could be the clue. Are we getting communication of a variety of styles into our classrooms, or are we sticking with aim, materials and method? That's where I'm going. Anyone else?
That's a good point. Okay, thanks. Yeah, sure. Just last comment.
Hello, I've been listening to you and I keep thinking back to one of my favourite communicators of science at the moment. I'm sure I'm not the only one, physics teachers. It's Mr. Brian Cox, Dr. Brian Cox, yes.
Professor Brian.
And yeah. Now, I think whenever I listen to him speak, he makes science so beautifully accessible. He's got a strand of physics, but you can see he weaves it to biology. The biologist in me loves him. My students really enjoy watching him. I enjoy watching him. We share the experience and it generates conversation. And then I look around in my public school science lab, dilapidated, sad, miserable. I've got 75 minutes, which is supposed to be really good, but I'm looking at the room and I'm just thinking, in terms of contemporary practice of science, should we still be in those labs? Is there anything that you're doing which explores the notion of these environments that we're teaching science in, and whether our students would be better served in a different environment, whether we just don't go into the science lab until we are going to conduct experiments when they perhaps think now's the time? Just curious.
Thank you. Just one last...
Well, I think that's probably a topic for another talk.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Someone...
Don't you think?
Yeah, I do agree. It's a... and we'll
But one of the things that might be useful for you, one of the other things, I mean, we've got a website so that you can access. So if you look at the Science Education Research Group website, we have this thing called STEM Talks as well. So what we've done is and we'll do it again this year, so we get researchers, it's sort of like TED Talks for STEM. But they talk in exactly the way that you're talking about with Professor Cox, right? So they start to talk about the way they do these things. I mean, my personal favourite is Beth McGraw talking about her mosquito saliva, her mosquito spit, right? It's really engaging, and it sort of starts to explore the horizons of what's possible. So it's not just about the lab. It's never just about the lab. It's all of the trials and tribulations that they've expended. And it's never quick. You know, these people have been working in these fields for more than 10 years. So, you know, some of that is fundamentally important. So you might like to have a look at some of those.
And I hate to leave you with nothing, so here's a one-liner. If the furniture is not flexible, don't use the room if you can avoid it.
There you go, wise words. Oh, Dorothy, sorry, you go. You get the mic.
I know it's a Monash event, but I'd be remiss if I didn't point out we do it too at La Trobe. And you can actually get onto Far Labs, which is a really good way of getting your students
that's
remote.
Its name.
Far
Yes,
Labs.
Far Labs.
Yes,
Okay.
so Far Labs, and they can do all sorts of virtual experiments, which will at least get you into the air-conditioned room, because computer rooms are always air-conditioned. I've been a teacher, I know.
Well, look, thank you, everybody. I just want to, final words. We really appreciate you coming out. So a big thank you to you as an audience coming out after school. It is the pointy end of the term, so we do appreciate it. And we're very glad to have met you and to have seen you. Of course, please put your hands together for our panel again.